As the India-Pakistan conflict comes to an end, what are the geopolitical implications for the world? President Trump holds yet another phone call with Vladimir Putin. Still no peace. What are the consequences for defying President Trump? Israel mounts a major operation in Gaza, working to finish off Hamas as international leaders express concerns. And finally, are unmanned sea drones the future of the United States Navy? You're listening to Mensch-Kight Geopolitics. Mensch-Kight Geopolitics is your home for conservative commentary on international affairs with an eye toward Israel and the Middle East. I'm your host, Isaac Kite, your lovable landsman, your gregarious Vulcan, your mad genius, your shadow president, and your prophet of things to come. Welcome back, Insiders, for another fun-filled and exciting episode of Mensch-Kight Geopolitics. My mention, my insiders, the supremely erudite, highly educated, well-informed, the most inside of the insiders. Let me tell you, my friends, oh my God, do you guys get good info here? I hate to toot my own horn. It's not something I do. Okay, I do a little. But I've been listening around to a lot of different experts and the usual suspects. And of course, podcasts like The Goodfellows, which, from the Hoover Institute, really great analysis there, right? Grumpy economist. You have H.R. McMaster, former national security advisor, right? And of course, the awesome Neil Ferguson, whose historical books are incredible. I've read most of them. Can't say I've read them all yet, but they are excellent. And, you have great people like that. And yet, as I listen to some of their interviews of late, there's a lot of areas where the elites, the highly educated, the people who are so much smarter than the rest of us are just way off. And I don't know, maybe it's the bias of being in academia. I don't know. I mean, I love Neil Ferguson. I really do. Like, his books are great. He has so many great things to say. But I'll tell you, my friends, his analysis on the Donald is just, I don't know. It's like he's on Mars somewhere. He is beyond the orbit of the Earth. It's out there. And he's not the only one. Republicans, Democrats, conservative commentators, liberal commentators, everybody's just way off. People out there talking about, the terrible economic choices made by Donald Trump could come back to haunt him. And it's like, what terrible economic choices? The tariffs? I mean, seriously. My friends, this is just driving me nuts. People need to get, I want to say, in the words of my generation, people need to get a clue. It's like Clueless. Movie from back in the day. God, all that stuff is ancient now. Oh my God. But in any case, they need to take a hint. Donald Trump said that these were reciprocal tariffs aimed at lowering trade barriers and seeking a renegotiation of trade deals. And a funny thing has happened since then. Every country in the world has come to sit down to negotiate new trade deals. We've agreed to one with Britain. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. Even China caved. I mean, I'll come to that here in a minute because that's big news. Even China caved. Okay, so we know what's going to happen here. Over the course of the next few months, these deals are all going to be signed and agreed to and this kind of thing, and we will iron all this stuff out. Okay, maybe some of the smaller countries we trade with will be working on those into the autumn and maybe even the winter. But by the end of 2025, all right, all these trade deals will be renegotiated for, ad nauseum, forever, right? Going on and on and on, ad infinitum. And we will have better trade relationships with the rest of the world. It's already happening. We have a trade deal with Britain, right? And that's going to mean U.S. beef, U.S. agricultural products can get into Britain now. So that's really good for our farmers. And that's just one country we're trading with. And, there are many, many more. And the deal wasn't so great for Britain, but Starmer Keir Starmer, Prime Minister there, is rather desperate. Britain really, really needs a deal. They really needed something to break. The British economy has been in a terrible state, but they need a trade deal with the U.S. like nobody's business. So they got one, and it wasn't the greatest, And if you saw the press conference, right? You have the Donald sitting there, and he's talking about all the great things for America's companies and the American economy, and Keir Starmer's talking about how great it was, the cooperation we had at Normandy and all of this so many years ago, because he doesn't want to talk about what's in the trade deal. I mean, it continues. British auto manufacturers, British automakers will be able to continue to export to the U.S. at a fairly low tariff rate, like 10%. And something like the first 100,000 of them will be exempt from the tariff. But still, I mean, we're gonna continue to trade. But our companies are gaining access to their market, and our farmers are gaining access to their market. Well, that's good. That's a better balance. That's what we're looking for. I mean, we, the American people, we, the working people, are tired of being sold out. And what's really hilarious to me is all these people about, unpopular economic problems and this kind of thing. And you go and you talk to average people, union employees, and I mean like employees who are organized, not the people who actually work for the union. Those poor people. Oh my God. You want to talk about, that's an interesting place to be. Okay. Anyway, the unionized employees and manufacturing workers, this kind of thing, right? You go talk to them. Everyone's for this, right? Everyone understands that tariffs are good for the economy, good for us, good for working people. Okay. So this is just going to blow over, and it's going to be a big nothing burger. In the end, everyone's just going to celebrate it. Trump's big, the big deal, right? The big bad deal, the big beautiful bill. It's coming. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime, all kinds of conservative defunding plan, Parenthood, $1.6 trillion in cuts. So many things coming. It's good stuff. And that's on top of the work Doge has already done, getting all of the fraud. Well, you can't get 100%, but they've gotten a lot of the fraud out of Social Security, out of Medicare. We're getting to a place now where, we know the people receiving benefits are much more likely to be actual people who are actually alive, living in the U.S., and who are entitled to the benefits. That's a good start. These programs are going bankrupt, and if we don't shore them up, if we don't protect them, we're going to lose them, my friends. We are going to lose them. So one of these things, and, I don't want to go back into it in great detail, but I did talk about, what we need to do with the budget, right? The budget is simple thing. We can make the whole thing go away, the budget, the debt, the whole thing. If we can cut spending and see economic growth, and cutting spending means we're going to have to do entitlement reform. Unfortunately, first we get rid of the fraud. That's good. But Social Security and Medicare are going to require some reforms to keep them solvent and fight the deficit. But we're getting there. But beyond that, cut taxes, get the economy going. As the economy grows, so too will tax revenues. And if we can keep the cuts, keep the government spending down, see the economy grow, tax revenue will increase, and we will start to see surpluses. And we need the surpluses. Like I talked about, we need a surplus of about $400 billion, right? So, it may be the first surplus, let's say 2028, we get $100 billion. Okay, we put that in the national debt. And then we get $200 billion in 2029. Okay, we put that in $250 billion, and so on and so forth. And when we get to $400 billion, we start making that 100-year payment on the national debt, and we put that in the budget. Right, that becomes part of our budget. So, we've got $800 billion in debt service, $400 billion in debt repayment, right? So we pay the interest on the debt, and we pay a little bit of the principal. And as I mentioned, with that $400 billion payment, that 100-year payment, in 25 years, that will pay down nominally a quarter of the debt in terms of its dollar value, but inflation will take out another quarter. So in 25 years, the debt will be halved, to all intents and purposes, right? So it'd be like $30 billion in numerical sense, but it'd be worth what would now be about 20 trillion, excuse me. So, you've got, the point is you take a $40 trillion debt and we can cut it in half in 25 years just by making a $100 payment on it. I mentioned, this is kind of how the British Empire did it from 1815 to 1914. A brilliant strategy of just slowly paying down the debt, and they more than halved their debt effectively in that time, and we could do it a lot faster. All right. Anyway, there's so many things. In any case, Trump's agenda is really coming along, and even Neil Ferguson talked about how Trump is keeping his promises. He laid out all the things he was going to do, and he's doing them. Funny thing, a president who actually tries to implement the agenda they were elected to implement. And there are already references being made to FDR. FDR's reforms didn't do a great deal to fight the Depression, but they did ultimately end the Depression, so let's be happy about that. So there you go. All right. So, Trump's doing his thing. Now, that's the good part. Real quick, I'm just, what are the negatives? And there are some things where I just, my head in my hands, like, his statement, the Russians would have won the war in Ukraine if their tanks hadn't got stuck in the mud. Okay, if you say so, Mr. President, except that the mud were city streets and the getting stuck part were the Javelin missiles that Ukrainians were firing into the tanks, destroying them. Javelin missiles that were transferred to Ukraine thanks to President Trump in Trump term 1, right? The first Trump administration, for which President Trump has taken credit many times. Like, he himself has taken credit for sending these Javelin missiles to... I don't know how he doesn't remember what he said. Like, how do you contradict yourself like that? I mean, just... and to make such a dumb statement, it's embarrassing. I voted for Trump. I appreciate the domestic reforms. We've made a lot of progress, but I voted to get rid of senility. Right? We had a senile president. We didn't need another one. And, this is kind of headed back in the Joe Biden direction. Donald Trump had a Biden moment. He pulled a Biden. My friends, this is not good. And it more importantly, you have the president repeating this Russian nonsense. These narratives. I mean, it doesn't matter what conflict you're in. I mean, after the Second World War, you had the German generals afterwards, the Hitler kept telling us to do that and he wouldn't let us do our thing, we could have won if they'd let us. Where have we heard that before? Everyone's always got an excuse, okay? But the fact is, the Russians tried to invade Ukraine. Ukraine did not want to be invaded. They resisted, and the Russian military is completely incompetent. It was even more so then. So the war has dragged on. And if you want to end the war, there's no other way than to arm Ukraine to the teeth, put sanctions on Russia, and bring Russia to its knees. Now, one way to do that is to work on China, which I'm coming to here in a minute. But at least we're doing that part. At least we're dealing with the China part. But it is just asinine statements like that. And then, Trump says, well, where are we going to get another phone conversation with Vladimir Putin? And as soon as he posted it online, I had to share it on X. Okay, how many civilians are going to die this time? How many toddlers? How many 12-year-old kids? Last time Trump said we were going to, and there was the drone strikes and, Vladimir, stop. Because, when the president puts the caps lock on and purports to yell on X, that's when, people really pay attention, right? Nevertheless, Vladimir Putin has slickly and cleverly defied Donald Trump several times, as politely and as gently as possible. And here we are. And what consequences have there been for Vladimir? None. His troops continue to attack. They don't gain much ground. The whole front is stalled just about everywhere. And the Ukrainians are fighting back. Europe is working to supply Ukraine with enough weapons and artillery shells and what have you to hold out. Ukrainian drones have been doing some pretty incredible stuff. And yet, the war continues in a stalemate because we won't give Ukraine the weapons they need to break the stalemate, right? Marco Rubio pointed out, U.S. is still sending arms to Ukraine. That's still going on. But, could we send more? The only way this is going to end is with, Russian defeat. The Russians are not going to quit. And, President Trump has come at this the wrong way from the very beginning, acting like somehow the Russians were winning this thing overwhelmingly. It was a done deal. And, he had to get Ukraine to agree to all these concessions so that the Russians would be willing to stop short of a total victory. The Russians are not going to stop short of a total victory. They'll stop short of a total victory the way the Japanese did in the 1940s and the Germans did when they were defeated. Right? The only reason Japan doesn't control China today is that Japan was defeated. They started a war, they lost. That's how it works. So, just nothing but frustration there. It's the one area where the administration has been embarrassingly wrong and has failed time and again. And, I mean, how long does Donald Trump want to look weak? Stand up, step up, and, act like you're large and in charge. We could be saying, well, Trump's such an alpha. Then why is he being a beta to Putin? It's time to toughen up. It's time to take a stand. Speaking of alphas, India and Pakistan. So, we know that India and its prime minister are definitely in the alpha camp. No, you don't want to mess with Prime Minister Modi. Recently had that incident in Kashmir where terrorists searched and a bunch of tourists and killed 29 people for being Hindus, right? Horrible event. But the latest straw in a long series of terrorist attacks on India financed from Pakistan, terrorists trained in Pakistan. So India stood up and they went to war. Things flared up for a while. India bombed the terror camps in Pakistan. Now, some pros and cons here. So, funny thing about geopolitics, India is using a lot of Russian weaponry, but it's also using a lot of European-made weaponry. Being neutral, India has been able to get a little bit of everything, whereas Pakistan relies heavily on China. So, what we saw in this conflict, and the dirty secret that the Chinese don't want to talk about, is that Chinese air defenses were terrible. India was able to bomb the places they wanted to bomb. They were able to launch missiles into Pakistan and hit whatever they wanted to hit. So the Chinese air defenses aren't any better than the Russian ones, and the Chinese are probably desperately trying to get their air defenses up to par right now. But that will give them some pause, right? There's talk about, did a new Chinese stealth fighter take out 3 Western jets? There's still back and forth about that. India hasn't confirmed it. It's, there's been back and forth. Evidence of it seems to have been fabricated. The Chinese company that makes those planes, of course, saw their stock go up. What a clever thing there, in a time when China's having all these economic problems. So, mixed bag of nuts at best. But for the most part, it looks like India was able to bomb where they wanted to bomb, do whatever they wanted to do, and Pakistan really couldn't stop them. And so we had this flare-up, and, this is the first major flare-up between armed nuclear powers. And it didn't lead to escalation. It just led to India bombing the terror camps and letting the Pakistanis know that they're not going to put up with this stuff. As for broader implications, so nuclear powers went to war and had a conventional conflict. That's a dangerous precedent, especially given the U.S. and China, right? Could the U.S. and China have a conventional war around Taiwan where nuclear deterrence breaks down, where neither side is deterred by the other's nuclear arsenal? That could be, that could happen. That is much more likely at this point, because once you cross the nuclear threshold, once you use that weapon, all cards are on the table, right? It's everything. It becomes a war of destruction at that point. Both sides trying to annihilate one another. So that's an interesting implication. The poor performance of Chinese air defenses and possibly, maybe their jets worked better than thought. There's some back and forth on that, but there's a lot to take away from this conflict, and technologically, it's not good for China for the most part. So that's those are the larger implications. That they were able to keep it from escalating and keep the conflict contained is a relatively good thing. But Pakistan needs to stop financing terror and having terror training camps in their country, and they keep saying they're, we don't sponsor terror. Oh, these were civilian targets. India was bombing civilians. Yeah, civilians in terror training camps. Some civilians. Okay, all right, if you say so. So that's that's basically where we're at and what's going on here. This whole these terror-supporting countries, they've gotten ridiculous. I mean, Pakistan used exactly the same narratives that Iran and their proxies use. And there were even people here in the West who just immediately jumped on the whole, siding with Pakistan thing, just like they do with Hamas. So, stupid is as stupid does, I guess. They're all on the same wavelength, and it's kind of dumb. All right. So there we are. Let's talk about China real quick, and then I'll dive into Israel and Israel and the Palestinians, Gaza, before going to the break. As I've talked about before, so China's economy is in really desperate shape. They're having some big problems, and Xi is facing some opposition within the Chinese National Congress. So he's starting to get pushback from a growing union between the Deng and Mao factions in the Congress. So Xi wants to be very careful. He wants to make sure he is not being thrown out of power. Dictators want to stay in power. That's their number one thing. So the phone calls that he wasn't, that his government denied and purported weren't going on, apparently did take place because, he negotiated a deal with Trump. And they were able to come to some kind of 90-day temporary thing, right? Where there are going to be 30% tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the U.S. on a temporary basis, and U.S. goods going to China will have a 10% tariff. Pretty good deal for the U.S., right? So with that, we're going to have a little bit better trade. Things will be a little bit more even. But for 90 days, that gets rid of the 145% and, these ridiculous tariff numbers that are just, once you get to 100%, and once you're at that point of being cost prohibitive, it really doesn't matter. There's no point in going from there. Your tariffs are already too high. They're stifling trade, right? So with this deal, things can kind of go back to normal a little bit for 90 days. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but there's time to negotiate a real full deal if the Chinese are ready to negotiate. And I don't know that President Xi has much choice at this point. The damage being done to the Chinese economy is deeper than anyone knows. I mean, it's getting, depending on whom you ask, and of course I listen to a number of different reports on the Chinese economy, some more, I don't want to say more plausible, some less so, but when you listen to Chinese dissidents, they do have their agenda of playing up negative stories from within China. At the same time, some of those stories are real. I mean, talk of whole companies shutting down and just vanishing, large, tens of millions of people going back out to the countryside to farm because they can't find food they can't feed themselves in the city. People taking lower paying jobs, people being deeply in debt, people struggling, literally like every day having to borrow money for their food and transportation to go to work because they can't afford to live, these kinds of things. It's interesting. A lot of people are selling their real estate. Now, if you know Chinese culture, you know that to the Chinese, owning property is just, it's a cultural value that cannot even be overstated. It's really, really important to them that they own property. They have to own at least one house. And that is a really big thing to say, I own this house, I own property, right? So people are selling their property, their one house that they own, to try to make ends meet. That tells you how desperate situation could be there. But again, getting information out of China takes, you have to take it with a grain of salt because the government suppresses the news stories and a lot of the dissident crowd are eager to sensationalize a little bit. But still, there are good signs that the Chinese economy is in deep trouble. So if that's the case, then China may no longer be able to finance, to help support and prop up Russia. They may not be able to help prop up Iran. They may not be able to help prop up North Korea and Pakistan. The Axis powers rely heavily on China. And weakening China is a good thing. So Donald Trump has definitely got an A+ from me on his China policy. China is reeling, they're struggling, they are having all kinds of difficulties, and they're forced to come to the table and negotiate with us. So A+ there. Having to give him a D, D-, barely passing grade with Russia and Ukraine, I guess. Mostly a fail. But we'll see. Maybe he'll get the idea and turn things around. That would be wonderful. But anyway, this frustrates me when people don't when they don't know enough, they don't understand a conflict. You have to go and analyze the conflict, and you have to have you have to be bright about it. I mean, as referring to a Neil Ferguson book, he wrote about how Kissinger goes to Vietnam in 1962, and he comes back from South Vietnam, and he's like, "There's no country. There is no country called South Vietnam. There's no reason for this place to exist. And if we're going to win a war there, the first thing we have to do is create a country. Well, how do you create a country that doesn't really want to exist, right? But that's the point. Like, he went there, he looked, and he saw, and he's like, look, there's nothing, there's no there, right? That's how he grasped the conflict, and he realized that making peace was going to require bringing the North Vietnamese to the table. Well, they didn't want to come, so they don't want to negotiate. They want to win. Same thing with Russia. Well, what did we do in Vietnam? We bombed the snot out of North Vietnam, and even turned China against Russia until North Vietnam was isolated and finally forced to come to the table. And then, of course, Nixon was ousted, and they ended up taking South Vietnam anyway, because we had become rather gutless by that point. But you get back to this point, like, was that a war worth winning? Was it really worth it to do all that? Because we talked about, well, if we'd made peace, then, forming a coalition between communist government and the South Vietnamese government, then the communists would just take over anyway. Well, fine. That's what ended up happening. So what's the difference? Kind of like we gave we spent 20 years fighting in Afghanistan to give give Afghanistan back to the Taliban. So what was the difference? We could have left and put the Taliban back in charge after 6 months, right? Why did we stay there for 20 years, right? In any event, you need to understand these conflicts in order to understand how to resolve them. And, that's what I do. My autistic brain that doesn't read people very well in real life, I'm able to read the actions, statements, and history of these various countries and figure out where they're coming from and what they're trying to do. And that's what I bring to you. That's the analysis you guys get right here. That apparently is pretty good. The more I listen out there, the more I realize you guys get some pretty awesome perspective right here. So appreciate you listening, and I'll keep bringing you more good stuff. All right, so the Israeli offensive in Gaza. First and foremost, we've had all this talk of some kind of break between Bibi and Trump. So Trump goes to Qatar, right? And, makes all these big deals, and they're going to invest, $1.4 trillion odd dollars in our economy and all this kind of thing. He gets all these good deals and talking about lending us a plane for Air Force One. Now, I don't want to dwell on it too long, but that has got to be the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I mean, we're going to let a private foreign citizen, this sheikh in Qatar lend a plane. I mean, given Qatar's ties to terrorism and Hamas, and they've been sort of playing footsie with Iran. I mean, they play both sides against the middle. That's how they do things in Qatar. But these are not good people. These are not our friends. So this was just one of those things that gave a lot of ammunition to embarrass Donald Trump, and it was a bad move, my friends. Not Trump at his best, but hey. I don't advise the president. I do so here on the podcast through you guys. As the shadow president, I say that was a really bad idea and terrible optics for the country. It was an easy way to say thank you, I appreciate the offer, no thanks, and walk away from that without the embarrassment. But that just didn't go over well. But now, after being in Qatar, it's possible the Trump administration, fresh off of all of that, was a little bit squeamish about this renewed offensive. But Israel has to finish Hamas. I mean, this has to end, right? Israelis cannot live after 10/7, after October 7th. Israelis deserve to live in peace and comfort, and we're almost there. We got to finish clearing Hamas out of Gaza. We've got to finish off the Houthis and stop Iran from sending their weapons over there. Regime change in Iran would be a really, really powerful thing. So these are the things that Israel needs to do so that Israelis can live in peace, relative peace and comfort, and be safe and confident in life, right? And they deserve to be there. So yes, there is a new offensive. It's mostly in northern Gaza. There's the recent killing of Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of Yahya Sinwar. And that was awesome. Apparently he and some top Hamas brass got together. It's possible that the government of Qatar sold them out. That's an interesting thing, an interesting rumor that's been floating around the Arab world. But the fact that, Qatar is this country that could know where he was, potentially, I mean, that just shows you what kind of people you're dealing with there. Anyway, so Israel's working on asserting its security. Even Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, the head of the other terrorist organization, Fatah, right? You have Fatah and you have Hamas. Even he has condemned, in English, condemned the situation in Gaza and called on the unconditional release of the hostages. No, he says those kinds of things in English and then he'll turn around in Arabic and say something else. But he wants the Palestinian Authority to take charge in Gaza. So polls suggest half of Gazans want to leave, like 3/4 of Gazans would want to leave if they could go to Europe. Trump has been talking about relocating 1 million of them to Libya. Interesting notion. Libya is probably the one country in the North Africa, Middle East region that the Palestinians could screw up. They screwed up Lebanon. If they, everywhere they go, they cause all kinds of problems, Jordan and other places. But Libya is probably the only country they couldn't screw up. It's already so bad, They probably couldn't make it any worse. Of course, there's a fear that a bunch of them would then be on boats on their way over to Italy. So Italy's going to have to shore up its defenses. They're going to have to work on, keeping these people out of Italy because you do not want these Palestinians in your country. These people commit crimes at such a horrific rate that is beyond ridiculous. And they're just, they have made themselves the scum of the earth. And people's conduct speaks for itself, right? And wherever these Palestinians go, they commit crimes that's so much higher than the average, even for migrants. And, they're incredibly racist. Right? We know that because they'd rather live in tent cities than give up the hostages, right? So far, we're still, 0 people in the Gaza Strip have tried to help the hostages. I was half joking with a friend the other day. It's like a biblical conversation, right? Abraham standing there in front of Sodom and Gomorrah. Hashem, would you spare them for 10 righteous men? For 10 righteous men, I would spare them. Would you spare them for 9 righteous men? For 9 righteous men, I would spare them. Would you spare them for 1 righteous man? If you can find 1 righteous man in Sodom, I would spare them, kind of thing. It's back to this. If you could find 1 righteous man in Gaza, we'd spare it, right? And we're not there. It's just these people are so incredibly racist. They are a cancer, right? And not because of their race, not because of where they come from, whatever. It's that culture that they have grown up with. It's the culture they have taken in. They've lived. They've refused to get rid of. Their parents have taught it to the children. You have this call from the kid that calls his dad and his mom, I killed 10 Jews, their blood is on my hands, and this kind of thing. He's bragging, and they're very happy for him, and all this kind of thing. He's going to die. Like, they know their son is going to die. It's more important to them that their son killed 10 Jews than that their son lives, right? That's how racist they are. That tells you everything you need to know, okay? So they can go to Libya, they can have fun there, they can't possibly make the place any worse, and they just need to stay there in Libya, right? Anyway, I think the closer we get, though, to any kind of actual relocation of the people there, the more likely that they would maybe okay, we'll drop the we'll tone down the racism a little bit if we can stay, right? But until you start approaching the conflict from these kinds of outside-the-box solutions, right? Until you start challenging the orthodoxy and start saying things like Donald Trump is saying, we'll just relocate half of them. That's how you create change. Because as long as it's the normal, the poor Palestinians, everybody over here in the West, and from the river to the sea, another Holocaust there will be, is what they're chanting on college campuses, slightly modified. Free Palestine really does mean Sieg Heil. It really means a permanent solution. We know because they're throwing things at Jewish students. Do they know that, are those Israelis? No. Are they necessarily people who support Israel or are very Zionist? They don't know that. They're just Jews. So they're throwing things at them on campus. At this point, Kenya has a whole bunch of peacekeepers in Haiti, right? So I guarantee you, if I go to a college campus and I protest and decry the occupation of Haiti by Kenyan troops by throwing things at African-American students, what will happen to me? What will the response be? Right? I'm going to go throw things at black students and to protest, Kenya's actions in Haiti. Right? I ostracized, tarred and feathered, locked up and the key thrown away. I mean, come on. They would be horrified if I were to do something like this. But you can throw things at Jewish students for, protesting the existence of Israel and your desire to murder Jews. Wow. To celebrate that stuff. Oh my God. Anyway, so Israel's strategic situation continues to be good, sort of in situ, close to Israel. So they have Gaza under thumb. Hamas is weakening by the day. They're losing their leadership. And, it doesn't sound like much, but the more of these senior terrorist a-holes that you whack, the more junior the top guys are. And then in time, that makes itself felt. Okay, when you have younger and younger guys that are leading who have less and less experience, less training, who don't have they're not wealthy, right? They haven't had a chance to become corrupted and get the money. So they don't know what they're doing. They're not motivated. They're not going to do as well as their predecessors. So in time, that comes to have its benefits. And with Hezbollah kind of, pinned down in the north and isolated, things are kind of changing, right? Syria, this guy al-Shara, it's he's got, Jelani, right? He's got everyone fooled. He's being, everyone's normalizing relations. Meanwhile, he's, got his people, his goons running around killing minorities in Syria. I understand that there's this desire to try to normalize and try to create a better situation with Syria. And this guy Shara has been talking about maybe joining the Abraham Accords and making peace with Israel and this kind of stuff. Well, of course he is. He wants to join the international community and make money and all this kind of thing. If he genuinely wants the best for Syria, then he needs to stop his people from murdering the minorities and start trying to build a country. Right? Countries usually involve minorities, and they have to be fairly treated. So Christians, Alawites, Druze, Kurds, all of these minority groups in Syria should feel comfortable and safe living in the same country with the Sunni majority, right? One would think, but that's not the Syria that he's building. So all I can say is thank God Israel blew up all the planes and missiles and all that kind of thing. I mean, the last thing that we needed was for the Syrian military equipment that al-Assad had, that Bashar al-Assad had. This didn't need to fall into the hands of the likes of Jelani and his crowd. As for Iran, we hear this and we hear that. Did Witkoff say this? Did Witkoff say that? Still nothing firm. After the meeting in Qatar, more talk of some kind of peace initiative with the Iranians. Kind of like with Putin, the Iranians have continued to defy Trump and nothing's come of it. We hear this and we hear that, but no progress. So just throw my hands up and say, hey, I don't know. I mean, I hear this and I hear that. That's all I've got. So anyway, I'm going to cut over to Eamon's Minute here and let you enjoy that. He's continuing with the saga of Hannibal invading Rome, one of his favorite episodes in history. And honestly, who wouldn't enjoy that? The elephants over the Alps and all this and great battles. And, this is the one leader who, basically had the Romans whenever he wanted to. And that sort of thing. So, it's fun stuff. Anyway, so after Eamon's Minute and the break, then I will be back.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Eamon's Minute, where I tell you a cool story from the past. Today we're going to be talking about what Hannibal did after he crossed the Alps. As Hannibal enters the Po Valley, Rome needs to stop the general. They send an army over to fight Hannibal as he enters the Po Valley. They fight a battle where the Romans lost 5,000 troops. Now, Hannibal, starting out with 100,000 troops, has gone down to just 25,000 after the crossings of the mountains, rivers, southern Gaul, and fighting the battle against Rome. Tune in next time, where the Romans are caught into a devious trap by Hannibal. And that's Amen's Minute. Back to you, Dad.
You're listening to Mensch-Kight Geopolitics with Isaac Kite. Or as the internet trolls say, mouthpiece of the Zionist conspiracy, spokesman for the elders of Zion, highly paid propagandist of the Mossad. Yeah, no. Now you're messing with the son of a mensch. All right, I'm going to make this section quick for you today, trying to move these things along. And episodes get long, and I have so much to talk about, so I'm trying to keep them down. Would like to post them more often, but, been under the weather a little bit lately. Allergies and the shifting seasons, they get me hard every time. So we have a company named Saronic, and they are working on naval procurement. They already make at least one unmanned drone for the U.S. Navy, and they're working on this concept they call Port Alpha, right? Mega Projects, which is a really great YouTube channel. If you don't follow Mega Projects, you get good information there. Is talking about their Port Alpha project, and I think it's funny because it's exactly what I've been talking about. Like, we need a major shipyard somewhere in Texas, and they're still looking to put one down. They've got a shipyard in Louisiana now, and I think there's one in somewhere else along the Gulf Coast, the Gulf of America now. Right, it's an entirely new body of water. Same water, new name. Anyway, so Saronic has this idea that they could have this place where they could churn out in quick succession a whole lot of unmanned seagoing drones. And, sea drones from the range of the cheap ones that I was talking about that are basically like ski jets that you could just drop over the side of a ship and they could go off and hit an enemy ship. Poor man's anti-ship missile, basically. That's one option. It's certainly a possibility, but these are much more sophisticated. These ships can carry anti-air missiles. They can carry guns. They can perform a number of different missions, and that's an interesting prospect, interesting set of possibilities. Basically, if you think about, the task force of the future involving aircraft carrier and a couple of escort ships, and then a lot of unmanned drones kind of running around the fleet, maintaining the fleet's security, that would certainly be better than putting more lives at risk and trying to build more manned ships. It's hard to build a lot of these ships. Now, we still need more of those. Remember my idea of building an American Corvette, basically, or getting a frigate program that we can actually build. Wouldn't that be lovely? In any event, so that's out there. We are going to have to build more actual manned surface ships and submarines, but drones provide an enhancement to those. They can make those ships better, right? So you imagine, maybe you have one frigate that could be patrolling part of the Red Sea, but it could have 2 or 3 drones, unmanned ships that are nearby that it can use to perform missions without putting any humans at risk, and basically, enhancing the power of one ship. Okay, this is an interesting idea. So their Port Alpha idea is that Saronic will build a port somewhere in Texas. I still say Port Arthur, Beaumont area, really great place. Real estate prices aren't too bad. So, skilled employees that are attracted to the area could get good jobs. There's good education in the area that would be happy to build the technical programs you need for your workforce. And it's, it's a nice little community to live in if if we bring in a little bit more money and economic vitality to the area. That would be good. If not, there somewhere in the greater Houston area, but Houston's already built up. They've got NASA, they've got a lot of stuff. So, I don't know that anyone want to be there. And Corpus is hot. You go on down the coast there. From there, it only gets hotter. I just don't know that you're going to be able to draw a lot of people down there. But Port Arthur is right there. It's a day trip from Louisiana, and so your employees would be happy to work there, and you can bring in, you get a lot of education in the broader area, closer to your ports in Louisiana, and you have access to the inland waterway and the various rivers in the area to move goods and raw materials in, and your finished products can sail out into the Gulf right from there. Okay, so. Yeah, it's the thought that I've had, but it's good to see that there's talk of this. We need more surface ships and submarines. We need more unmanned vessels, unmanned aircraft, and unmanned submarines, undersea vessels, right? Anyway, so as this stuff is built, and as these ideas are kicked around, they need to get started. They need to get expedited. We see kind of how the Navy of the future could come together with a smaller number of personnel and a smaller number of manned ships and a larger number of unmanned assets that can go out and do their damage to the enemy. I mean, this is an interesting idea. And as we saw in Ukraine recently, with unmanned drones shooting down fighter planes, I'd rather send a drone with no humans on board. Maybe it's expensive, maybe it's, $100 million drone, but I'd rather send a drone ship out and attack the Chinese Air Force rather than bring a manned ship within range of Chinese aircraft, right? There's no question there. One scenario is preferable to the other. We don't want to risk our people when we don't have to. So, interesting idea. The other thing is, I talked before about this idea of what I call the crazy horse drones, right? Where you have a cheap drone, kind of like the Iranian Shahed drones, right? They can be made for, depends on whom you ask, between $8,000 and $20,000 each. So I did this scenario where I said, look, let's make an American version for $100,000, put them on, 5 to a truck and deploy them in batteries, 20,000 strong in a place like Taiwan. And you can do all that for about $1.5 billion, right? Whereas, ships and aircraft carriers and all that only have have much more limited capabilities, right? An aircraft carrier is $13 billion. And then you have to buy the aircraft to fly off of it, right? $2 billion for a submarine. That's a lot. But if the Chinese knew that there could be 20,000 of these drones launched in less than a minute of them initiating hostilities, and that they'd fly, deep into China, hundreds of miles into China and hit targets, even if you had 2 to a target, that's 10,000 targets, right? And we could have 2 of these batteries in Taiwan and 1 in South Korea and 1 in Vietnam. And see what I'm saying? Like, you could spread these things out. I ultimately talked about maybe having something like 7 of them, like 1 in Poland, a battery of 20,000 in Poland, right? About 20,000 in Romania, 20,000 in the United Arab Emirates. That right there would put Iran on notice, right? And then, a battery in Vietnam, 1 in South Korea, and 2 in Taiwan. All of that, right? 7 of these things. Okay, and you're still at about $10 billion, still less than the cost of an aircraft carrier. And now we could hit, 140,000 targets in the Axis powers, anytime we wanted to? Okay, so that was an idea. Now, my idea for this was, you make a cheap drone with a propeller engine. Well, the Russians shot down a drone, captured it, and claimed that it's a Ukrainian drone. So we don't know for sure, but this thing was really slick. It was a flying wing design. It had just 2 fins on the back, still less than 10 feet long. It had a jet engine, and it was made with carbon fiber materials. Now, I had mentioned when I was on the Crazy Horse drones that by the time China built up a defense, that they could finally track and shoot down most of these drones, we'd make them stealthier by using carbon fiber materials, right? So drones under 10 feet long, Ryan Macbeth talked about this recently. Drones under 10 feet long, under 3 meters, seem to be pretty good on radar cross-section. As long as they're low flying, they don't tend to show up on radar. It doesn't seem to be a problem. When they make the drones bigger than 10 feet, then they start to appear on radar, and that starts to become a problem for the drones. They're easier to track and easier to shoot down. So this drone, just under 10 feet, and it has carbon fiber materials, you know what I'm saying? And a jet engine, so it's much faster. I mean, so the Ukrainians are already building the ultimate version, the upgraded version of my idea for a crazy horse drone. That shows you how fast this technology is moving. But the point is, think about that. Think about 40,000 drones like that. Flying wing, carbon fiber, jet engine, sitting on trucks, in Taiwan, where, the truck has a hydraulic ramp that could just lift up and extend, and 5 of these drones take off right away and fly to their targets, right? You'd have it so that, you give the order to launch. It can be done automatically. Trucks driving down the road gets the launch order. The drivers pull off to the side of the road and bam, these things are off, right? They'd be difficult to track. The trucks wouldn't necessarily be on the Navy on the base, right? Like I said, tensions rise. They can send these to drive down any highway in Taiwan or any other country, right? So they'd be difficult to track and find. Anyway, and you send these things off. And the main cost I was thinking in the $100,000 cost over, say, $20,000, because we always have to have all the knickknacks and thingamabobs and technology and whatever. But if you put in a sophisticated computer, just sophisticated enough to have the right AI to avoid air defenses and get it to the target, then you could send it messages via satellite to update its orders or change its target profile. But if it could not communicate, if it was cut off from communications, right? EW, right? You have electronic warfare. So if it was jammed somehow and isolated from command, it would continue to perform its mission. The point is, the Ukrainians already have this thing. And so I'm just sitting here like, my musings, my friends, my ideas and my notions are already at play in the war with Russia. But if America would get on this game, if we'd actually build these things and actually do this thing that I just talked about, along with the naval drones and whatever, I mean, war has been revolutionized. Already, my notion for the Crazy Horse 1 drone, the idea that the cheap Shahed drone, simple plastic drone with a propeller engine, basic computer on board, just enough power to take it to the target with a reasonable size explosive. You could double them up if you wanted to destroy something. But look, I mean, in terms of communication infrastructure, antennas and stuff like that, that stuff is fragile. So, this thing goes off near it, boom, it's going to damage it and shut it down. You can damage a lot of military equipment with some of the small explosive, right? You can ground a jet by hitting it with a grenade, something the size of a grenade. That jet is going to be in trouble for a while, right? You can damage fuel tanks. So the point is, you can do a lot of stuff with a small explosive, okay? This thing had a much bigger explosive and a jet engine and carbon fiber manufacturing. It's already the Crazy Horse 2 drone. They're already a step ahead of where I was talking about. But I love it when I come up with an idea and then somebody makes it. I've talked about this, I've done this many times before in my life. I predict things that happen, and I talk about technologies, and then they're found in the real world, for better or for worse. When we invaded Iraq in 2003, in early 2004, I wrote a brief for the White House sent through my congresswoman at the time, and suggesting that there was one particular guy that I thought would be a good president for Iraq, that we should just invite this guy to form a government. He was a Shiite cleric who was moderate enough to be acceptable to the Sunnis and the Kurds, and he had been in Iran but was not too beholden to the Iranian government. So I thought this was a guy we could work with. And lo and behold, a month after I sent that brief in, his mosque was blown up. Al-Qaeda whacked him. Like, they saw what I saw. They saw that this guy could be the next leader of Iraq, and they killed him, right? There are times when sometimes I come up with these ideas, and then our enemies come up with them too. And I'm telling you, when you're playing this chess game with people, it's kind of scary when you realize that, holy mackerel, these people are at least as smart as I am. That's a terrifying thought, like, holy mackerel, oh my God. And so here we are, they're making the drones I was talking about. cool stuff. The other thing we need is a hunter-killer drone of some kind. 'Cause, with airplanes, when they first started appearing over the battlefields of Europe in 1915, they were doing reconnaissance, right? So they would fly over the enemy positions, map them out, note where they're located, where their artillery is located, and that would be information that would then be useful by ground forces, right? Well, the Germans didn't like Allied planes flying over their lines, and the Allies didn't like German planes flying over their lines. So the Germans developed the first fighter plane, right? A plane designed with a gun on it so that it could go shoot down these reconnaissance aircraft. And then pretty soon, the French had their fighter and the British, so we had, fighters fighting each other to establish dominance of the air so that they can perform recon missions, right? Your fighter goes and clear out the enemy fighters so that your planes can conduct recon and then go home. Well, then, planes started bombing and all this kind of thing. And as they became more capable, they went from there. But the fighter, right? We really need a hunter-killer drone. And I know this is out there. Ryan Macbeth fielded a question about it in a recent video. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to answer because, whatever he knows, he can't talk about publicly. But this is what we need to have. A drone with AI capabilities that can take commands from afar, but that can operate on its own, that can identify enemy drones in an area and destroy them, and not by physical intercept, right? It has to be able to shoot something like a shotgun shell with, some kind of variable time fuse, some kind of VT fuse, right? Proximity detonation that would damage and down the enemy drone, right? And it could carry many of these. Basically, a drone fighter plane. You know what I'm saying? That could go out and inexpensively destroy all of these drones and be reusable. One of the good things about the Roadrunner, which is a drone interceptor, is that if it doesn't hit a target, it is a physical intercept. It goes and it intercepts and it explodes near the target. But if it does not intercept a target, it returns to base. And that's beautiful because then you don't waste them if they don't find a target, right? But we're spending all this money on, weapon systems from the Marder, the German Marder with its big guns, to put up a lot of lead to shoot down these drones, or air-to-air missiles, or this kind of thing. That costs a lot of money. Surface-to-air missiles. These cost a lot of money to shoot down cheap drones. So, you shoot down a $20,000 drone with a $1 million missile, that's going to end up draining our coffers pretty quickly. And that's why I think we should have this hunter-killer drone. And then ships could launch HK drones that would patrol around the ships, right, within a certain patrol area. Or you could have them patrol along the front lines. And, like this drone is being operated by our side. You ignore that drone. Oh, that drone doesn't belong here. Shoot it down. Something along those lines. So that's the next thing that needs to be developed. But it's interesting to see that technology coming along so quickly. Well, it has been a short episode, thankfully. You don't need to hear me yap on forever. And I've been way too long in posting it. I've got to get these out to you guys more often. But, I'm trying. So with that, I will say, as always, goodbye, Lehitraot. My friends, as I've recorded this and I have not yet published, I find a terrible news story I have to bring an update. A young couple has been gunned down near the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. Two people who were apparently, he had bought a wedding ring and was going to propose next week in Jerusalem. So a young couple has been murdered by a terrorist in Washington, D.C., and the terrorist, when arrested, was shouting, "Free Palestine." So we know what they mean when they say "Free Palestine." It's not just, war over there. It's murder of Jews right here in America. This act of terrorism is heinous and horrifying. My prayers for the family, and we need the victims. I don't have their names yet, but what a horrible thing to be gunned down like that in the streets of Washington, D.C. Horrifying thing. Hope we get the death penalty for this vile terrorist who gunned them down, and that will be justice. So, with that, just recording this supplement to let you know about that. I'll talk more about it in the next episode. But terrorism in the U.S. now.
Writers of the history, stand with me. Look into my eyes and see. People go away but never say goodbye. Someone stole the moon tonight, took my light. Everything is black and white. Who's the fool who told you boys don't cry? Hours and hours and flowers. Life is no game for the cowards. Why? The time goes by. Every day I'm losing my mind, holding on in this mysterious ride, dancing in the storm. We got nothing to hide. Take me home and leave the world behind. Baby, promise me that never again. I'm still wet from this October rain. October rain. Living in a fantasy, ecstasy. Everything is meant to be. We shall pass, but love will never die. Hours and hours and flowers. Life is no game for the cowards. Why? The time goes wild. Every day I'm losing my mind, holding on in this mysterious ride, dancing in the storm. We got nothing to hide. Take me home and leave the world behind. Baby, promise me that never again. I'm still wet from this October rain. October rain. October rain. Baby, promise me that never again. I'm still wet from this October rain. October rain. Shall I feel